All right, everybody, we're going to get started. Good evening. Welcome to tonight's program. What think you of an American fleet? The history of the Continental Navy here at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. My name is Selena Austin, and I am the Programs and Communications Manager here at HSP. And we are so delighted to have you here at 13th and Locust in Philadelphia and also online via Zoom tonight. So HSP, if you don't know us, proudly serves as Philadelphia's Library of American History with a collection of over 22 million manuscripts that hold stories of all Americans with a particular emphasis on early American history, as we'll hear about tonight, as well as ethnic and minority groups, science and industry, the arts, and genealogical research. Tonight's talk serves as a signature lecture accompanying our current exhibit to provide a naval armament, which was co-curated with Homecoming 250 in commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the founding of the Navy and Marine Corps. This exhibit examines nearly 2 centuries of naval history through the lens of Philadelphia, highlighting the role of the city and its citizens in building and sustaining our nation's sea services. Since its founding in 1824, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania has collected and preserved military records that tell the stories of Americans who served and the communities that supported them. The original historical documents, this exhibit to provide a naval armament, builds on that legacy, allowing us to bear witness to the everyday people who shaped the history of the Navy and Marine Corps. As we approach the nation's 250th anniversary next year, we have the opportunity to reflect on America's founding, its growth, and its ongoing renewal. This exhibit serves as an entry point to that process, inviting us all to consider how the efforts of revolutionary citizens help define who we are today. How do their courage, service, and civic commitment continue to shape our national identity? And how might we carry those values forward into the semi-quincentennial next year? So while you ponder that, I have a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Once again, this is a hybrid program, so we have both people in the room with us and online via Zoom joining us. So welcome to our Zoom audience as well. If you are viewing this online, you can click the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. And we will be recording tonight's program, and it will be sent to everyone, whether you attended in person or online, in a follow-up email. We will have time for questions at the end, so in the room, you can ask your questions here, and our virtual audience can use the Q&A function throughout the program as you think of them. And for our in-person audience, following the lecture, we invite you to stay for a light reception where you can also view our exhibit and hopefully speak with our author and speaker tonight, Tim McGrath. He's over there. Now it is my pleasure to turn it over to J.J. Ahern, Museum Coordinator for Homecoming 250 and co-curator of To Provide a Naval Armament, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Selena, and good evening, everyone. I'm J.J. Ahern. As Selena noted, I am the co-curator for the current exhibit and museum coordinator for Homecoming 250, the organization that brought the Navy Marine Corps home to Philadelphia last week to celebrate their 250th birthday at the will of George Leone here, the president and CEO. And they will be back, the Marines will be back in November again to celebrate their special day. As a plug, many of the exhibits, like the one downstairs, are open into 2026, so please check the website homecoming250.org. I first met Tim McGrath when I was working at the American Philosophical Society Library while he was researching John Barry, which intrigued me and led to many rewarding conversations. A member of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania for over 2 decades, Tim is the author of John Barry, An American Hero in the Age of Sail, and Give Me a Fast Ship, The Continental Navy and America's Revolution at Sea. He is a recipient of the Samuel Eliot Morison Award for Naval Literature and a 2-time winner of the Commodore John Barry Award for Maritime Literature. His latest book is James Monroe, A Life, and soon to be published, 3 Roads to Gettysburg, which explores decisions made by Lincoln, Lee, and Meade before, during, and after the battle and their consequences. Tim doesn't just study the age of sail, but he's also an avid sailor. He serves on the board of port wardens at the Independent Seaport Museum, is a chair of the Ancillary Board of New Cortland Adeldercare, and was a member of the board of the Fort Mifflin on the Delaware. Tim is also one of the nicest persons you will ever get to meet, and someone I am privileged to call a friend. Without ado, I'll give you Tim McGrath.
Well, after that introduction, I think all I can say is thank you all for coming. But my thanks to Dr. David Brigham, to Selena, to Justina, who's managing everything for the online for Zoom, and Chris Damiani, who's been invaluable with our research on the book on Gettysburg. I'd also like to mention folks who worked here and have retired just because of how much help they were to me over the last 22 years. Dan Rolfe, Max Muller, Rob Medford, Amanda Dean, and Sarah Heim come to mind. I also, thank you. I agree, Chris. Thank you. I also brought my favorite document after 20-some years of research on these books. It even has the old takeout sign from the Historical Society. I won't read it to you, but it's a letter during the War of 1812 from Abigail Adams to Secretary of State James Monroe. And to paraphrase it, she's basically saying, John and I aren't getting any older. John Quincy is in Russia and also trying to negotiate an end to this war. Can you bring him home before we die? And Monroe's letter, which is part of his papers, is a very kind and gentle letter back saying, we will do everything we can to get your son home. Please rest assured that that's foremost in my heart and determination to do. It was 4 years later that Quincy Adams did return. However, when Monroe was elected president and went on this very famous tour that begat the phrase era of good feelings, he did stop at Peacefield, had a wonderful stay with Abigail Adams and her husband, John, and John and Jim did not get along earlier. In fact, when Monroe returned from a stint as minister to France, things had gone so awry for him with being an ardent Republican and Washington being sort of a closet Federalist and Adams being a Federalist, that Adams referred to him as a disgraced minister. So when he announced in 1800 to Governor James Monroe that he was coming, and the usual ceremony is the governor will meet him, Monroe wrote a letter back saying, you're welcome to come. I am not going to welcome you. Adams did not come. However, in 1811, when Monroe was made Secretary of State, he got a letter from John Adams. Dear Jim, congratulations on becoming Secretary of State and wish you all the best. Adams probably did a little bit of thinking. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, President. James Madison, Secretary of State, President. James Monroe, probably the next president. It's so wonderful that you've gotten this job, Jim, and wish you all the best. But this is a very, very nice letter. There's one other document I want to share with you because it also had something to do with the Monroe book. It was in the galleys, and everyone from the oldest of historians to the current ones on Monroe made the comment that he never freed an enslaved person. Somehow, filed so you couldn't find it downstairs, somebody with HSP did. And it turned out that James Monroe freed a slave, Peter Marks, who was married to one of Sally Hemings' nieces. And he freed this man on his deathbed. So it's amazing what you can find downstairs. The research working on the Gettysburg book, and I knew Meade designed and built lighthouses up and down the East Coast, but to see his writings and his comments and his designs and how he was getting through things, it's just wonderful. And then, of course, if you touch anything down there by Abraham Lincoln, it's like handling the Shroud of Turin. So I recommend it to all of you. Now let's get down to business here. The first time I was called on to speak on behalf of an Irish-American naval hero was over 60 years ago in the fall of 1960. Our fourth grade teacher, Mother Mary Rachel, decided that there would be a presidential debate followed by a class election. My friend Fred, who was not only the smartest kid in the room, but the smartest kid in the world, would stand in for Vice President Nixon. To my immense delight, I was selected to speak for Senator John F. Kennedy. I had a hairline then. With the untrammeled zeal of a 9-year-old, I plunged into my past. It wasn't enough to rehash the senator's phrase, "Let's get the country moving again." I needed to communicate fully about the recent recession, the missile gap with the Soviets, winning the space race, and the importance of the islands of Quemoy and Matsu. And I was pumped, so pumped, in fact, that when a 6th grade girl told me that Nixon wants to send American kids to school on Saturdays, I dismissed it as hogwash and restudied Quemoy and Matsu. And by debate day, I was ready. But so was Fred, who I'm sure taught Bill Gates everything he knows. The recession could only be worsened, he remarked, by the Democratic Party's love of something called deficit spending. There was no missile gap. The space race would be won by our German rocket scientists and not their Russian counterparts. And it was paramount to realize the implications of Quemoy and Matsu by their longitudes and latitudes and their proximity to mainland Red China. Fred knew their longitudes and latitudes. Before an audience of 30 Roman Catholic children, Fred's Nixon was thrashing my Kennedy. Finally, Mother Rachel gave each of us 30 seconds to sum up. Quoting Churchill, Fred reminded the class that a democracy like America's is poor government, but much better than a communist one. All I could reply to such wisdom was, if Mr. Nixon is elected, we will all go to school on Saturdays. When Mother Rachel asked where I obtained my information, I said from someone a lot older and smarter than myself, and Kennedy won in a walk. I promise tonight's remarks are rooted in far more accurate documentation. The Continental Navy story is not just about ships, and it is not just about dates and battles. It is a story about politicians, visionary shipbuilders, sailors, officers, some very brave, many with tragic ends, and a few buffoons. It's about wives and lovers, and like all narratives from the first part of our collective story, it's about enslaved Americans. And while we can't tell all of this remarkable but rarely told saga tonight, I'd like to share with you what I learned about these extraordinary men and women. By the 1770s, the economy of Britain's American colonies was so dependent on the maritime that every man's business, be he a fur trader, furniture maker, factory owner, plantation squire, or an employee, indentured servant, or enslaved person, the food one put on the table was in large part due to the maritime. The Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean Sea, and the bodies of water that cloak Western Europe were the major highways of business. So when the colonies began openly defying the British government over taxes on goods, levies on shipping, and stamps on everything, it was common to find sailors ashore among the protesting crowds. In 1773, while the Indians of the Boston Tea Party included silversmiths like Paul Revere, physicians, lawyers, merchants, and shopkeepers, there were quite a few sailors among them, although it was a blacksmith's apprentice, Joshua Wyeth, whose descendants would include 3 generations of distinguished American artists, that had the best line about the affair, calling it such a large cup of tea for so many fishes. Flash forward to April 21st, 1775. John Barry, the top captain for the most successful merchant firm in Philadelphia, Willing and Morris, was coming up the Delaware aboard the finest jet-built American ship, the Black Prince, returning from her maiden voyage to England. Meanwhile, at the City Tavern, the St. George's Society for the Assistance of Englishmen in Distress. We don't have clubs with such catchy names anymore. We're having their annual St. George's Day feast upstairs. Robert Morris was proposing a toast to the health of King George III when a courier burst in with news of Lexington and Concord. While others spilled their glasses and upended chairs in their rush to spread the news, Morris alone raised his glass, toasted the American cause, and stepped out into the uncertain future. The next day, under what Barry noted in his log as fine, clear sunshine weather, the Black Prince nestled against the William Morris dock to a scene of total pandemonium. One onlooker described a river covered with ships and the wharves covered with inhabitants. The waterfront was clogged with wagons full of goods, merchants whose ships were at sea or didn't own any, pleading with their colleagues to give them space in their holds for their goods, stevedores and dockhands jostling each other into the water, going up and down the gangplanks. Cargo wasn't loaded so much as tossed. The merchants were at the forefront of resistance to Crown policy, declaring they would fight for their rights. Now, upon learning that their fellow colonists in Massachusetts had done just that, they hoped for just one more killing in the English marketplace before the real killing came to the Delaware. Even Barry's ship was returned to sea without properly being refitted. The idea of an American Navy began with Congress in general and John Adams in particular. Outside of successfully defending several Yankee sailors for slaying a Royal Naval officer whose press gang was physically attempting to add their names to the King Navy muster rolls, Adams had no maritime experience at all. In fact, he had only been out to sea once in his life, a 15-mile fishing trip to Cohasset Rocks off Massachusetts. But Adams had left his wife Abigail and children at their Braintree farm outside of Boston, where they could see the bombardment and attack of Bunker and Breed's Hills, and he was receiving regular reports of the dangers around Boston, not from the Boston papers, but from the mother of his children. How when a British man-of-war anchored nearby, as Abigail put it, it occurred an alarm in this town and we were up all night. When Adams queried to a colleague, "What think you of an American fleet?" he was not really asking. From May to October of 1775, he argued for such a force. The first battle of the Continental Navy was fought in a room in what is now Independence Hall, 40 feet 40 inches long and 38 feet 6 inches wide, about 1/3 the length of a frigate and slightly wider than her beam. Adams' most vociferous foe was the imposing Marylander Samuel Chase, a lawyer with a vicious tongue, and he relished using it. An American Navy for him was the maddest idea in the world. While both men enlisted allies among their colleagues, the enemy helped Adams' cause just by being the enemy. The British Navy began shelling New England towns, while the ousted Royal Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, used a British frigate as his home in exile, God bless you, organizing both a loyalist fleet of privateers and declaring freedom for all enslaved men of patriot owners if they would join what he called his Ethiopian Regiment, an emancipation proclamation predating Lincoln's by 88 years. By October, even Chase saw the Navy as a necessity, and on the 13th, the Continental Navy was born. While Congress purchased merchantmen to convert into warships, and Adams drafted articles of war for the new Navy's officers and sailors, Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island cherry-picked 4 of the 5 first captains out of his family and New England contacts, including his brother Esek, who became the first and only commander-in-chief of an American Navy. Commodore Hopkins would face the Royal Navy, the finest war machine yet created by man. King George's captains included Andrew Snape Haymond, later knighted for his services during the war. So here's our guy, and here's theirs. Who do you want to bet on? John Adams called his serving as midwife to the new naval force the pleasantest part of my labors in Congress. But it was a colleague of his, Benjamin Franklin, who took full advantage of this new force once he arrived in Paris. Seasick throughout the entire crossing, Franklin was specifically ordered by Congress that once he arrived in France, he was to let old England see how they like to have an active enemy at their own door. For most of the war, Franklin did just that, handing out commissions to American mariners and giving orders to cruise the British coastline, capture or destroy British shipping, driving up insurance rates and spreading a level of fear along the British coast not seen since the Spanish Armada. Congress appropriated $870,000 to build 13 frigates, with construction assignments given to ports from Portsmouth to Baltimore. The amount was woefully short. When an epidemic of inflation later set in, Congress found itself appropriating $1 million just to refit and repair one frigate. The frigates were drafted by shipwrights like Joshua Humphreys, a Quaker who was disowned by the Friends for his military efforts, who came up with handsome designs and innovative methods of construction. Once at sea, these frigates were beautiful to behold and the envy of European experts who beheld them approaching their wharves. Most of the sailors for the First Fleet were from the Philadelphia area. Able seamen were offered a whopping $8 a month to sign the muster rolls. Landsmen received much less. Even today, few jobs are more dangerous than being a commercial sailor or military sailor. But in the 18th century, a sailor's day was similar to that of a modern fireman. Hours of boredom punctuated by death-defying acts of courage necessary to survive. Living before the mast and the forecastle, a sailor was exposed to the elements during his watch, then sent below to rest in a crowded area reeking of bilge water, livestock, smoke, and unwashed shipmates. Now he was also introduced to a new hazard, battle. In an effort to stand against the expertly trained gunners of the British Navy, Continental officers drilled their sailors incessantly at their guns. The goal was to match that of a British gun crew and complete the 11-step process in under 2 minutes. But because they lacked powder and shot, the Americans had the shadow box, pantomiming their moves until the last round when they might actually fire a cannonball. Tun Tavern in Philadelphia, of whom George Leone, our friend here who coordinated the Navy's 250th celebration, knows more about than any man alive, I'm guessing, gave birth to the Marine Corps. The second in command for the Marines, being recruited for the new Navy, was Robert Milan, whose mother, Peggy, ran the Tun Tavern. The family of the commander of the Marines, Captain Samuel Nicholas, owned the Conestoga Tavern in Philadelphia. Coincidence? Any Marines here in the audience can judge, but these men distinguished themselves in battle after battle. It was a Marine, the Scotsman William Hamilton, tenuously crossing the foot ropes with a basket of grenades above the Bonhomme Richard and the Serapis, who turned the tide of battle for John Paul Jones. Many Continental officers were experienced tars, but quite a few landsmen joined out of patriotism or for the adventure of it. They certainly did not join for the money. Congress, thinking sailors an ignorant lot, boasted that they offered larger percentages of pay and prize shares than the Royal Navy did. What they didn't tell their sailors was that those shares went into effect after Congress claimed half the proceeds of the sale of captured prizes and goods, while the King's Navy got their shares based on 100% of the money. Sailors might not have been as educated as the politicians, but they knew how to add, and they saw who was subtracting. Throughout the war, Congress bemoaned that privateers, armed merchantmen given letters of marque, allowing them to seize British ships and keep the money from all sales, and took the lion's share of available sailors who quickly saw they would make better money by not serving in the Navy. Many congressmen invested in privateers themselves. The term conflict of interest must not have been coined yet. In one letter, Robert Morris bewailed privateering in one paragraph, only to mention he was investing in a privateer in the next. It's estimated that black sailors comprised as much as 10% of the Navy's muster rolls throughout the war. Quite a few were enslaved. One bought by John Barry before a cruise, fought in an early battle. Barry was no sooner ashore when he resold him. The man, whose name is unknown to history, appealed to the Pennsylvania Committee of Safety for the money he believed he had earned in combat. He was not looking to buy new slops or spend it in taverns or brothels. What he wanted to purchase was his freedom. After fighting against the British with the same degree of courage the rest of the crew displayed, would the Commodore intervene on his behalf? He would not and could not. Countless enslaved men, including those owned by congressmen, saw action at sea on Continental ships. All of them, including this man, saw their wages and prize shares go to their masters. Many of them jumped ship once their vessel reached port. Their captains called their act desertion. Their owners called it running off. These men called it freedom. One African American who personified both devotion to duty and true resilience was Philadelphian James Fortin, a free Black teenager who signed on a privateer to provide an income for his widowed mother. His ship was captured by a British frigate whose captain, upon learning James could read, took him under his wing while James tutored the officers' sons. When the ship reached New York, young Fortin was offered the choice of serving in the Royal Navy, returning to England with the captain's family, or be transferred with the other prisoners to the prison ship Jersey on the East River in New York, the Andersonville of the Revolution. Fortin chose the Jersey. He survived the war and returned to a mariner's life, inventing a new system of rigging that was used throughout the age of sail and becoming a prominent Philadelphia merchantman and abolitionist. 1 year after the Navy's birth, the shortage of manpower grew so pressing that captains signed on Army cast-offs, invalids, jailbirds, and even British prisoners, often used as Marines. Many a Continental captain orders his officers and Marines to keep a weather eye out for treachery, and they frequently found it. The Navy's muster rolls often included foreigners as well, Frenchmen, Scandinavians, and the closest foreigners, as far as the government was concerned, Native Americans. On one of Barry's voyages, a Native American sailor learned of a plot aboard the ship by British hands to kill the crew, the captain, and all officers save one to navigate them home. His telling Barry of the plan saved many lives and resulted in the ringleaders being flogged mercilessly while hanging by their thumbs until they named their accomplices. Other foreign-born hands included two shipmates on John Paul Jones' most famous ship, the Bonhomme Richard. John Jordan, listed as hailing from West Bengal, actually East India, and a 12-year-old cabin boy from Naples, Giuseppe Braccialeria, whose name the officers shortened to Joseph Brussels, an act of Americanizing a foreign name 100 years before Ellis Island made that a habit. In the Battle of Flamborough Head, Jones's great victory that incurred the highest percentage of casualties of any fight, land or sea during the war, both these sailors lost a limb, Jordan a leg, Brussels an arm. Despite the risks of battle and the elements, and their rarely being paid by Congress, Continental sailors showed courage, endurance, and humor. In the late days of 1777, the frigate Randolph, under Nicholas Biddle, sailed into Charleston Harbor after a 3-day cruise had netted 3 prizes. The cheers were barely out of the throats of South Carolinians when Biddle's men were surprisingly paid their shares. Their subsequent celebration became the stuff of legend. Dressed in the latest finery, they were seen at all hours along the Charleston waterfront, newspapers reporting their escorting females ridiculously ornamented with jewelry. For services rendered, we can only imagine. One man bought a horse and tack, only to prove that as an equestrian, he was one hell of a sailor. Later, authorities found him dead drunk, carrying his saddle and bridle. Slurring his words, he explained he had lost his ship, but saved his rigging. The Continental Navy's list of captains include few well-known names, but each one possessed his own unique approach to management and personality quirks. They were all skilled mariners, and they were all brave. We only have time to shine a lantern on 4 of them, 3 of them Philadelphians. There was young Nicholas Biddle, who served in the Royal Navy before the war and went on an expedition towards the North Pole with Horatio Nelson for a shipmate. Biddle's courage was as second nature to him as breathing. "I fear nothing but what I ought to fear," he matter-of-factly penned to his brother. A dashing, handsome ladies' man with an uncanny sense of when and whom to fight. He would have likely eclipsed Jones and Barry, but for one tragic split second. John Paul Jones, the Bantam Scotsman, was a peerless mariner. He saved one frigate from sinking in a brutal storm by cutting off her masts and anchoring her to keep her from foundering. He was a true visionary, writing page after page on how to improve the Navy's ships, ordnance, and organization. He was his own press agent, even writing poetry about his deeds. Jones' initial successes against the British in the Western Hemisphere were breathtaking, but he is better known for Flamborough Head and his earlier raid of Whitehaven, Scotland, to burn British ships in port. He only burned one, and an attempt to kidnap a Scottish laird to exchange for American prisoners, only to find his crew of kidnappers were cowed by the absent laird's very pregnant wife. Nevertheless, both unsuccessful acts created panic up and down the British coast and went a long way towards increasing anti-war sentiment in Britain. And there is Gustavus Cunningham. How many of you have heard of Gustavus Cunningham? An Irish-born Philadelphia captain who captured or burned more British ships than Jones and Barry combined, cruising British waters, commanding a small cutter, a fast ship favored by smugglers, but half the size of a frigate, and terrorizing the British Isles. Of all the American rebels, it was Cunningham who King George most wanted to hang, and he almost got his wish. Cunningham carried out his actions while France was still neutral, forcing King Louis XVI's government to publicly rail against the man England called the Dunkirk pirate, while all the while happy to see him wreak emotional and financial havoc on their ancient enemy. Cunningham did more to bring France into the war than anyone, with the exception of Franklin. His daring attacks all around the British Isles are forgotten now, but he truly was the real Errol Flynn. If there was a sailor's captain among the lot, it was John Barry, who still had to face down one mutiny by British prisoners, one by American tars, and an unofficial one by his unpaid officers. On the whole, his men liked and respected him. One officer wrote how the innocent mirth of the seaman was his delight, and good humor would extend to permit himself to be the subject of joke and mirth. When anyone had neglected or done anything wrong, and when asked by Captain Barry how he came to neglect it, the person would begin to state he thought so-and-so. Captain Barry would hastily say, "Who gave you the right to think?" Which occasioned the crew to address their comrades. "Who gave you the right to think? Don't you know that Captain Barry thinks for us all?" On one instance, he overheard the line and let a long silence send the speaker into quiet fear before breaking into laughter himself. His adventures in the Revolution read like a Patrick O'Brian novel. His first command, the brigantine Lexington, won the first American victory over a British ship, the sloop Edward, in late June 1776, while Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence. Excuse me. Barry and another intrepid captain, Lambert Weeks, sent their man by longboat to Turtle Gut Inlet in what is now the lake area of Wildwood Crest to unload barrels of gunpowder off a merchantman under fire from two British warships. On January 3rd, Barry and his sailors fought with the Continental Army in Washington's victory at Princeton. During the Valley Forge winter, after Barry lost his frigate Effingham in an incident with Congressman Francis Hopkinson that reads like a colonial version of Caddyshack, Barry took two barges with muffled oars and passed occupied Philadelphia in the dead of night, slipping past the docked British squadron and the posted sentries. He then embarked on a cattle rustling adventure with General Anthony Wayne before capturing two transports and a schooner, part of a convoy coming up the Delaware. The next day at Port Penn, as a nor'easter howled and the British began firing on his small captures, Barry dashed off a note to Washington at Valley Forge, along with a captured cheese and a jar of pickled oysters, which Barry hoped would crave Washington's acceptance. He was given command later in the war of the frigate Alliance, the finest American-built frigate of the war with a history of bad luck. But under his command, the Alliance had 2 successful prizes-taking voyages and 2 memorable battles at sea, one against 2 British men of war that began just when the wind died. The enemy ships, having sweeps, could row into position on either side of the Alliance's stern while she lay helpless. After 2 hours of fighting, Barry took a shot of grape in the shoulder and was carried below, where an hour later, his second command approached him asking leave to surrender. They did not surrender. The second battle was fought against the frigate Sybil off Cape Canaveral, where Barry outthought, outsailed, and outfought his opponent. 2 months after the Treaty of Paris had been signed. Small wonder when 11 years later, President Washington asked Barry to be the first captain of the United States Navy. And there were the women who loved these men. Nicholas Biddle shamelessly flirted from Nova Scotia to Philadelphia until Elizabeth Baker, the daughter of a Charleston plantation owner, won his heart. Before his final voyage, Biddle redrafted his will while making plans to marry her upon his return. And Elizabeth did get married 19 years after Biddle's tragic end. John Paul Jones was quite a ladies' man, literally having at least one girl in every port. Jones was once smitten with the young African-born poetess Phyllis Wheatley of Boston, and even wrote a poem to her. John Barry's wife, second wife, the beautiful Sarah Austin, not only dealt with her husband's absences, but the consequences of a family rent in two by the war. Some historians call the Revolution our first Civil War, and Sarah's family proves it. She was a stitch sister of Betsy Ross. One of her flags flew atop Jones's ship, the Ranger. But while her brother Samuel marched with Barry and other Philadelphians and sailors to fight with Washington at Trenton and Princeton, her older brother William was such a staunch loyalist, he was given responsibility by the Howe brothers after the fall of Philadelphia to see that the departing patriots didn't burn the city down. When the British left Philadelphia, William went with them, not into exile, but as a mate on one British ship and later commanding a 20-gun loyalist privateer, and never saw Philadelphia again. It fell to young Sarah, now caring for her half-sister's 8 children after the woman died in childbirth, to fight for the return of the Austin estate seized by the Pennsylvania Assembly for William's actions. When Gustavus Cunningham was captured by the British off New York, he was sent to England to hang, weighted down with 55 pounds of chains. Congress and Franklin wrote letters protesting his treatment, but he was spared the noose only after Washington promised the British that 6 captured Royal Navy officers would meet the same fate. Cunningham was sent to Mill Prison in Plymouth. Certain that her beloved Gusty would be killed, his 24-year-old wife from Philadelphia, the remarkable Anne Hockley Cunningham, gave her children to relatives and crossed the Atlantic in a Philadelphia merchantman. If life aboard sea was difficult for sailors, just imagine what Anne went through. Seasick, unable to cross the deck except on a sailor's arm, her nausea returning again and again while she tried to sleep on a pitching sea. Once in France, Anne informed Ben Franklin that she would stay until reunited with her husband. That is devotion and a special courage we can only admire. With peacetime came a horrific recession. Depression is a more accurate word. And the sailors and officers cheered in the streets and sung about in the taverns, now haunted the waterfronts, desperate for any kind of work. Moved by their plight, a penniless John Barry borrowed $200 from a bank to buy their shares at a reduced rate, just to give them money to feed their families. When the bank called in the loan, Barry asked his friend Anthony Wayne if he could loan him the money. Wayne didn't have the money either. Partisan politics began playing a part with these appeals, even if the petitioners had no political affiliations whatsoever. It only mattered who or what side presented the petition. When 3 survivors of Flamborough Head, amputees Joseph Brussels, John Jordan, and another James Mackenzie, appealed to Congress in person for disability pensions, Congress did not deliberate so much as bicker. Since this memorial was sponsored by Robert Morris, a sizable block of congressmen opposed it merely because Morris supported it. Finally, the imposing Jordan hobbled back in on crutches, appealing to Congress's sense of decency. Even with such a stirring appearance, their petition was only passed by 3 votes. Oh, and Congress finally appropriated funds to pay off John Paul Jones's sailors from the Bonhomme Richard in 1848. Doesn't this sound familiar? As the soldiers, sailors, Marines, and their families of the American Revolution set the bar for devotion to duty and sacrifice for succeeding generations of Americans, so too did Congress and the public set the example of support the troops as long as no taxes are levied for the best weapons, decent wages, or the care for their widows and orphans. Through the 8 years of the Revolution, the Continental Navy had 57 ships, but by war's end, there were only 2. John Adams, so optimistic of the Navy he created at war's onset, now wrote at war's end, "It is very difficult to think of our Navy without tears." Yet only 15 years later, he became the first president to use the new United States Navy in the quasi-war with France. Wouldn't it be wonderful if John Adams and Abigail, one of the first Americans to argue passionately for gender and race equality, if they could see what we have seen and read regarding our Navy, what think you of an American fleet? What would they think of an American fleet that was sent to sea by James Monroe and subsequent presidents to capture slave ships and free their captives while Congress kicked the issue of slavery down the road? What would they think of an American fleet torn in 2 by civil war, who first sent ironclads into battle at Hampton Roads, thereby making every other navy in the world obsolete? What would they think of an American fleet led by the USS Olympia, the oldest steel ship still afloat, that went from Victory at Manila Bay, transported the unknown soldiers' remains from France to Arlington, and whose muster rolls include a former officer of Admiral Farragut, Admiral of the Navy George Dewey, and Franklin Van Valkenburg, the captain of the USS Arizona? What would Adams think of the Americans at sea during World War II, including my uncle Jack Coyle, a medic and chief petty officer in the Merchant Marine, family friend Bob Starr, who lied about his age to join first the Coast Guard and then became a Navy aviator, C.B. Coxswain Carmen Bucci, one of my friend's fathers, semi-conscious in his last days on Earth, repeating the phrase, "We'll get off this island," as he returned in his sleep to the Pacific, or Corpsman Ellis Shield, who left his foxhole on the Admiralty Islands to tend the many wounded on the beach, was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his gallantry and was my mother's first husband. What would the Adams think of a U.S. Navy that was the first line of defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when President Kennedy and Admiral George Anderson used the Navy in the same judicious manner that Washington and Barry first discussed in the spring of 1794? Or of the stellar accomplishments of naval aviator Alan Shepard, Marine Corps aviator John Glenn, and naval aviator Neil Armstrong, who with their comrades in space orbited first Earth and then the moon before walking on it? What would the Adamses, especially Abigail, think of an American fleet that has performed countless humanitarian missions around the world for generations, and whose example of leadership in this century include Admiral Michelle Howard, best known as the woman who handled the rescue, of the Maersk? And what would they think of an American fleet? Indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tim. And I think we do have some time for questions. Also, this is a good opportunity for a shameless plug for the exhibit again downstairs. So if you heard some things that interested you, like the Alliance, you can see a ledger book from the Alliance. You can read Joshua Humphrey's handwritten notes and other materials mentioned in Tim's presentation downstairs. Any questions from our audience tonight?
Yeah, George.
Of course, George. I'm going to ask you to speak into the microphone so our audience on Zoom can hear.
This just shows you haven't seen me speak into a microphone before. Anyway, if you had been at John Adams' elbow in 1775, knowing in advance how the revolution would go, what would you have told him to do? Would you have told him to go forward with his idea or to abandon the idea of challenging the most powerful navy in the world?
Well, thanks for such an easy question, George. I don't know how many of you have ever read Six Frigates by Ian Toll, who has also done a wonderful trilogy on the war in the naval war in the Pacific. But I'm paraphrasing, I don't quite remember, but he basically says that the Continental Navy was a waste of money and time and lives. I respectfully disagree. I think the Navy, it was not created to go toe-to-toe with, the British fleet. So an American squadron was not about to go fight a British squadron. Our first squadron, in fact, after picking up some gunpowder in the Bahamas, encounters one British ship of war, the Glasgow. And the account of it reads like 5 teenagers walking down an alley and finding a guy they think that they can roll for his money and finding out that he was a middleweight boxer. It did not go well. But there were enough successes, certainly Jones's, with his voyage up through Nova Scotia on the sloop Providence, and then his later voyage with the Ranger and then the Bonhomme Richard. Barry had quite a successful career in his actually 7 years as a Continental Navy captain. Nicholas Biddle was impressive. In fact, he actually tackled a ship of the line in his last battle when something touched fire with the magazine aboard his frigate, the Randolph, and it blew up, leaving just 3 survivors. And finding the ship that found them, reading the notes of it, it's almost like Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. But Abraham Whipple, who a lot of people don't remember, and he with a small squadron literally go into a great, huge amount of British merchantmen being protected by some British ships. And they change their flag and go in and, what are you doing? What are you doing? Tagging along at the end. And then capturing about a half a dozen British merchantmen with this ruse coming back. It's easy to judge yes or no with that, but I think the final thing, the 2 things I comment with that, George, is it proved to be an excellent training ground for that generation of captains and officers who 15, 18 years later would be our first American Navy captains. Barry's United States, his cruises during the Quasi-War weren't headliners. He didn't capture or fight off, as Thomas Truxtun did, 2 French ships. But he used the frigate United States, which, if for those of you who wonder what it looked like, just look at the Constitution. About a year after the first cruise, Barry added a roundhouse to the top. I don't know why. I couldn't find anyone who actually, what did he do that for? But it's the same blueprint as the Constitution. And he used the frigate United States as the first U.S. Naval Academy. His midshipmen and lieutenants include Richard Summers of the Summers family, who was killed trying to destroy the American frigate Philadelphia in Tripoli Harbor. His friend Stephen Decatur, who went on to glorious days as a captain in the War of 1812. And Charles Stewart, who wound up at the end of the War of 1812 commanding the Constitution and having his own successes. And his grandson, for those of you who are Irish or Irish American, is Charles Stewart Parnell, the great Irish politician from the Victorian age. So I think Adams is right that you can't think of it without tears, but you have to remember the successes that they had and the example that they set. One would say, was Washington really a great general? Yeah, no. but he was the best we had. And he set an example that was followed up through and including this day by the best of our military officers. So I can see where Ian came up with that, comment and everything else. But if we were in the room now, we'd have quite a polite, spirited conversation. Other questions? Yes.
You're gonna wait for the mic. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I'm a little confused about Nicholas Biddle, though. Is that same Nicholas Biddle that was later involved in banking, or the Bank of the United States?
That was his, that was another relative, another Nicholas.
Okay,
He
because,
also had a brother, Charles,
yeah,
who was a good sailor and everything else. There's a funny story about Charles. I'm sorry. After the revolution is over, Barry's going nuts like everybody. We haven't been paid. And, a few blocks away in 1787, the Constitutional Convention's going on. And it's enclosed. They even closed the windows. They were that worried about what was going to come out. And this is July, August, and September. But afterwards, the Pennsylvania Assembly immediately begins debating, will we vote to approve this Constitution, on the second floor of what's now Independence Hall. And there's a significant portion of representatives, mostly from central and western Pennsylvania, who do not want this Constitution. They do not want a central government of this girth and size. And they're supposed to come back one September day after lunch and have a vote to say, yes, we will have a vote on this. We will debate and have a vote on this. And they have a ringleader named James McCalmont from western Pennsylvania. Think Hawkeye from The Last of the Mohicans meets Newt Gingrich.
wow, great.
And he has a partner, Jacob Milley. And he says, look, if we don't go back, they don't have a quorum. Let's go home. They can't do anything. There's an example of something that still goes on today. And the leaders are furious, the Fitzsimons and Mifflin, like, we want to have a vote on this. Barry's attending these hearings. They called it the gallery, but it's just a roped off part of the second floor. And they say, well, how many more do we need? And they figured out 2. The next morning, the assembly goes into session, call for a roll call. They're still too shy. Barry has shown up with fellow sailors, stevedores, wharf toughs, any roughneck he could find. And as soon as that is told, he slips out and heads to Boyd's Tavern, which was about a block or 2 from Independence Hall, because that's where McCalmont and Milley were staying overnight. One newspaper said they found Milley hiding in the outhouse. But Barry's group takes these guys kicking and screaming, and we're not talking about timid little souls. It's not Speaker of the House Mike Johnson they're carrying down. These are physically frontiersmen. And then carrying them up 2 the flights of stairs and throwing them into the room so we have a quorum.
Yeah.
Barry's having dinner with his friend Charles Biddle, Nicholas's brother, who's now the Attorney General for the city. And over dinner, he says, Benjamin Franklin wants me, and I ordered me to issue a warrant for your arrest for your treatment of these men. Franklin wanted this passed too, but he and Barry never quite got along during Barry's trips to France. So Barry's going, what the hell are you telling me this for? And he goes, aren't you sailing that ship, the Asia, to China next month, or whatever it was? And he goes, yeah. He goes, I will issue the warrant for your arrest as soon as I can't see the Asia going down the Delaware River. So he still kept in a bit with the Biddles.
Just one more comment, if I could. The Gustav Cunningham is buried along with Decatur at St. Peter's burial. Yes, at 4th and Pine. So that's a little tidbit.
I'd known they were buried there, but there's so many other. Samuel Francis from Francis Tavern is buried there, and both Decaturs. Yeah, it's quite a yard.
So I think you can learn more about the Biddles at the Andalusia Estate, which has a partner exhibit with Homecoming 250 as well, right?
Yep.
Right, George? I'm looking at you. A question over here, and then I think we have one on the Zoom.
It would seem to be an economical solution for Congress to issue letters of marque and encourage privateers. Cheap.
Yeah.
private enterprise
Yep.
to harass the British. So what was the tension between founding a formal Navy versus expanding the privateer campaign?
The, the conflict or the differences were both between Congress, who were there were congressmen very upset. Like I said, Morris is bemoaning, we have all these privateers writing to another congressman while Congress is in recess, but at the bottom saying, by the way, if you've got some money, I'm investing in a privateer. So there you have it with that. But the sailors really, once they realized they had a better chance, not only of getting paid on time, but also, they're raiding merchantmen. They're trying to stay as far away as they can. Ironically, the privateer that James Fortin was on, the captain was Stephen Decatur Sr., who was captured. So that was the real, and Barry had 2 voyages with a brigantine, the Delaware, as a privateer. And he did it mainly because they didn't have any Continental ships for him to take over after a frigate of his, the Raleigh, was captured. And he needed the money. That's a good question. Any other questions?
We have one on the Zoom. I'm sorry, did anybody raise their hand in the room? Okay, great. Have you done any research on the Pennsylvania Navy and specifically the galleys?
That's a really good question. And I can put in a plug for the Historical Society of Pennsylvania because there's a ton of information on the Pennsylvania galleys and the Pennsylvania Navy. They were mostly row galleys. And they did service when Andrew Snape Hayman's Roebuck came up in May of '76, and it was the row galleys that they had. Barry and another captain's frigates were being built, so there wasn't anything he could do. But they really came in handy and fought very bravely during the attacks after Brandywine and Germantown when the Royal Navy came up. And they had, they blew up a ship of the line. The Augustus somehow blew up in the conflicts. And the men at Fort Mifflin were exceedingly brave. Their last captain was a fellow named Stephen Smith, who was badly wounded. And on November 15th of '77, he and his men got out of Fort Mifflin. They left the flag flying. There's a great, and I'm sure some of you have read Joseph Plum Martin's story, his narration of his life. As a teenager, his first battle was up at in New York, and this rout of troops. And then he's at Fort Mifflin, and he said the bombardment, which was all day long, the longest bombardment maybe in American history on our shores, for sure, longer than Fort Sumter or the Union bombardment in North Carolina with Fort Fisher. But he said it looked like a plowed field. That's how much damage the cannonballs did. But the Pennsylvania Navy, the leader captain was a fellow named Hazelwood. And he was a very brave captain. They did quite a bit. And you're talking about row galleys going against frigates and brigantines and sloops of war in the Royal Navy. That took a lot of courage.
All right, thank you so much, Tim. Please, another round of applause for Mr. McGrath. So thank you so much for being with us tonight. We invite our in-person audience to join us again downstairs for a light reception and to view the exhibit if you have not yet already. And of course, to speak with Mr. McGrath if you'd like. You can find his publications at Westholme and at Penguin Random House. And for those of you in the audience, we do have a few for sale downstairs as well. And we invite you to stay connected with us. You can sign up for our newsletter at hsp.org/enews. Thank you so much and have a great night.
Thank you.